My guest, James Fallows, has written about these questions. He's in Beijing. He's been reporting from China for The Atlantic since 2006. In the current edition of the magazine, he has an interview with the head of the China Investment Corporation, who oversees many of China's American holdings. Fallows also has a new collection of his articles about China called Postcards from Tomorrow Square. You know, there was a time when you were writing about technology for The Atlantic, and you've been writing a little bit about what it's like to navigate around the internet in China, and most Americans know that China has kind of a firewall. There's the sites you're allowed on and the sites you're not allowed on the internet in China. So what do you have to do to get around that and get to whatever site you want?
There is a simple way to get around the entire blockage of the so-called Great Firewall of China, and that's to spend, as I do, $40 a year for a so-called VPN or virtual private network, or to use proxy servers or other kind of free services. If you try, you can get around all the different ways the censors have tried to keep people within China from getting to sources of information outside world. What's fascinating about this, I think, is the Chinese authorities don't really care about me and whether I'm able to go see some free Tibet site that's being run from London. They don't really care about people in China who have $40 a year to get these services, or people who can read English well enough to be able to see what's available in the rest of the world. What they really care about is making it just inconvenient enough for most Chinese people to get outside the strictures that they won't bother, and that most Chinese people will spend most of their time reading Chinese language sites that are run in China and supervised by the Chinese authorities, and that does the job. And it's a kind of subtle repression, which is different from the way we usually think of how the Chinese government operates, and is in its own way admirable in its cunning. You know, of course, one deplores any constraint on free expression, et cetera, but I find myself admiring the ingenuity with which it's set up.
And as you point out in your writing, if you're Chinese and you want to write a blog in the Chinese language, you kind of have to do it on the official government site if you want Chinese readers, because that's where everybody is.
There's a really interesting sociological point about this. There is, of course, a huge Chinese diaspora of Chinese-speaking, Chinese-literate people around the world, lots of them in the U.S. and Australia and Europe and other places, who often are writing things in Chinese that are part of the ongoing political discussion in China. But one observer was telling me that if you want to be in the Chinese game, you really have to be inside China, that people in the long run, they get kind of cut off from the flow of discussion. They lose their feel. It's like people writing about American politics from Kazakhstan or wherever. There's a way in which you become cut off. And so most of the attention by the Chinese audience is to sites that are located within the country. And once they're in the country, the government really has the whip hand, as we say. People use, if you go into an internet cafe, you have to register with your real name. There are internet censors and internet spies and people who are there kind of as agitprop counter bloggers. If some subversive blog comes up, they'll have a lot of hostile comments on it. So once you're within territorial China, then I will use this perhaps unfair analogy. It reminds me of a whole country run by Fox News, where there's one line that comes out and maybe different from Fox News's, but there's the same kind of thoroughness that goes with it.
So what was it like for you to watch the election from China?
What was most different about being in China from being other parts of the world and perhaps from being in the U.S. is there was less emotional content to the election here, I think, than other places. This is a widely observed phenomenon in China, and I think I can explain it this way. One is there is a preference, there's been a preference for China for the familiar, known quantity in the U.S. of making no ripples. If it would have been possible to have George Bush in office for another 4 years, he would have won by a big landslide in China. Partly that's because he's been relatively good for China, partly because they always want more of the same. If it couldn't be George Bush, they would want to have Hillary Clinton, because she also was somebody they'd been familiar with in the past, despite some of her own disputes with China. And there were two other factors which I think affected the Chinese view. One is they viewed Democrats as being, on the whole, trouble for China on trade issues. So they thought, regardless of anything Obama said, there might be trade problems. And a delicate point, but a true one, the fact that Obama will be the first non-white president of the U.S., which was a symbolic plus in so much of the world, I think was a symbolic minus here. That attitudes, racial attitudes towards within China are what Americans would view as anachronistic. It is still quite natural for educated people to say that they view whites as talented and blacks as untalented, blacks as having bad work habits, blacks as not being educated. And so the idea that a black person could be the head of this powerful nation took more adjustment within China than in other countries.
So long as foreigners are being used, there's still hang up about the outside world affecting their own culture. The essential point here is that the Japanese are a homogenous society, and they do have a purity hang up. They do believe, and for the United States point of view, you might find this offensive, but they do believe that their strength is in their racial purity. Let's be quite frank about that. So under those circumstances, foreigners are always, on that definition, either a menace or an oddity. And now, of course, it's much better to treat them as a bit of an oddity than a menace.
And the Orientals are going to be much more vicious than the Europeans. They don't have a liberal philosophy that you can use against them, and a constitution that you can throw at them. They don't have that liberal image that they try to protect, like the white folk that you use to tie them up with.
China is quite racist, yes. Many Chinese have the idea that Africa is very backwards, and African people, they don't work very hard. Africa's whole continent is very poor.